Hey there, Nicki here of Life by Design. A few weeks ago, I shared a video with you that was all about brush control and giving you some things that you could practice in your sketchbook to help you build your confidence with watercolor painting and really understanding your brushes. In this week's video, I want to talk to you a little bit about my process for how I lay down color using really simple techniques that are essential called wet on wet, lifting, and even a little bit of blending. So along with the brush control video, and if you didn't watch it, I'll link it below, and this video, I want you to really lean into what I'm going to share with you in terms of technique and process so that you can start to adapt pieces that speak to you within your own practice and how you approach watercolor painting. So really quick, easy ways that you can practice your watercolor techniques daily, and that truly is the magic to getting better with your watercolor painting. Let's get started. Okay, so it's all about water control. I decided to work in, this is just a handmade sketchbook that I made with a variety of watercolor paper. It's not my favorite paper, but I'm using up paper and supplies. I also put some sketching paper in here. It's just a variety. I love making my own sketchbooks. I love buying sketchbooks. Art supplies are just something that I invest in. So I have here just a sketch of a coneflower. I'm going to paint it using some blues, and I want to talk to you a little bit about wet on wet, some lifting, and also a little bit of blending. I don't have a ton of paint here on my palette. Maybe I'll do this so you can see this better here. I'm just going to try to use one brush for this one too. Keep it a really simple practice. Don't complicate it. Think about the technique that you're working on and just kind of be open and see what happens. That's what I'm going to do. So there are two different ways that I start to paint flowers like this. One is by laying down some water. I'm just going to go ahead and again, I think this might even be 50% cotton paper, so it may not behave the way that I want it to, and we're just going to see what happens. So I'm just going to lay down a little bit of water to work wet on wet. I'll pick up some of this. It looks like it might be cerulean blue, which is a favorite of mine. I don't have a ton of paint on my palette. Once I wake these dried paint splotches up, it'll start to move. There we go. So now I've got water on my brush, a little bit of water on my palette, and water on my paper. So I'm going to work wet on wet by just letting my brush connect with the page and starting to drop that watercolor down. Okay, so while it's wet and I'm just working a little bit intuitively, following my brush strokes, or sorry, my pencil lines, and laying down some of that pigment. Now, while that's still wet, I'm gonna wash my brush off, dab it off on my paper towel here, and I'm going to start lifting a little bit. I want the pigment to stain my watercolor paper. Really important to use good quality pigment. I'm going to go ahead and put my paper towel here so you can see what I'm doing. Really important, use professional watercolor paints. You can create all these techniques of lifting, working wet on wet. Let's pick up some of this blue and see what happens. Activate it. I'm going to tap off. I've got a lot of water on my brush. I'm going to tap off that excess water. And while my paper is still wet, I can drop down a little bit more of that paint, creating a nice darker value here, and I can even just bring it into different points. And because it's still wet, it'll seep and move without little effort by me, but I'm starting to create that really nice effect of tonal value. I think this is Payne's Gray. Yes, my favorite Payne's Gray. And I'm going in again. My brush isn't very wet. I picked up a really super saturated amount of paint, and I'm just dabbing in while it's wet. Now I'm looking at the flower while it's still wet. I'm just wiping my brush off, dry brush. I'm going to go in and even pull out. So I'm going to lift a little bit more highlight because I really want that light blue to feel transparent and to give the edges of these petals a little bit more lightness. Okay, so my paper is still wet, the paint is still wet. I always say while your page is still wet, you're in control. So I'll even go ahead and mix these blues. My brush is fairly dry. Let's go ahead and add a bit more water to activate them. I'm gonna dab off the brush because I do have a lot of water in my brush, and I'm just going to go back in a little bit as the paper is kind of damp and create a little bit more of that blue effect. Okay, and it's kind of a going back and forth. So here maybe it's getting a little bit too dark. I'm just looking at moments where I can create, again, just a little bit more tonal value in some areas, keeping some areas nice and light, pulling a little bit of that Payne's gray out, and you can see how much dimension is in that flower already. Okay, so now if I want to blend a little bit, I'm going to again wet this stem of the flower. I'll grab some of my green. This looks like it's sap green, and I'm going to apply some of that green to this flower. Now you can wait until the actual petals are dry, but I like to kind of blend it all together, just again to create an interesting abstracted watery vibe to my watercolor painting. Okay, so I can give that a moment to dry. Yes, my green has seeped into this part of the flower. I'm okay with that. And even these really wet parts will create some bloom. I'm totally okay with that. This is my sketchbook. It's an opportunity for me to play and to show you how I work and building up a little bit of tonal value using the watercolor pigment itself and the character that this pigment has. I'm just going to drop in some perylene green, and how you can create some really interesting texture within your watercolor painting. So while it was wet, I wanted to work wet on wet again, and now I'm going to dry my brush off and I'm going to blend those colors together. Okay, so it doesn't have to be a solid flat wash of color. I want you to mix the colors together to create something really interesting and unique, and it's not just a flat wash of color. Okay, so now as this is drying slightly, I can even go back in, pull away some of that green that bled. So you can fix things like this if they, you know, maybe you're like me as I'm recording this, a little impatient, but I kind of like how really nice and soft that is. And I might even soften this area here and lift. There we go. And it's a process of kind of push and pull. I'll go back to my blues. Again, I'm working with tiny amounts of paint, but I like to use that paint on my palette. I don't like to wash them away. Ooh, and I really love that effect. So again, as I'm playing, I'm gonna work with, my page is a bit drier. I'm gonna work with that and create some really nice effects here on this flower. And I'm really pleased with where it is, where it's at in terms of how much interest. I'm just gonna go in with, while it's still wet, my page is still slightly wet, I'm just gonna go in a little bit more with this perylene green. Again, working wet on wet, and then a little bit of that green as well. Okay, and that's it. It's just a matter of creating some opportunity to work wet on wet. We did some lifting, so we pulled that pigment away, and then it did a little bit of soft blending. If you work on those three skills when it comes to your watercolor painting, you'll be able to paint in a way that creates an easy process for you, where you can paint some dynamic, beautiful pieces. I'm just gonna pull a bit of highlight off of that, maybe even the center of this stem. It allows you to paint these really simply beautiful pieces without a lot of complicated techniques that you can just repeat and practice over and over and over again. Okay, let me know if you enjoyed that. Give it a try, and let me know in the comments if you want to see more videos like this and how things are going. Give the video a thumbs up, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you next time.